If there's one night in the year when the world falls silent, not because it has found all the answers, but because it has just realized it's standing before something too sacred to name, it is Holy Thursday. That night didn't begin with thunder or glory, but with a simple table, 12 confused men, and a teacher who chose to wash the feet of each one. That night the Creator wrapped a towel around his waist and knelt down, as if to say, "This is how much I love you." We are not called to fully understand this, because maybe we never truly will, but we are called to step into it. Step into a love not based on emotion but on sacrifice. A love that doesn't promise ease but does promise you'll never be alone if you dare to follow. This video isn't a history lesson, it's a mirror. And the question staring back from the glass is this: if you were alive that night, what would you do? Stay, walk away, or kneel? If something stirs within you, stay until the very end. And if you want to walk with us through more journeys of faith, consider subscribing. Not because we need followers, but because you deserve to be reminded that sometimes the most important truths don't come through noise, but through a table, a glance, and a love that dared to be betrayed. We often imagine that God reveals himself through majesty, with thunder, lightning, or wonders far beyond human understanding. But on Holy Thursday night, something strange and sacred happened. God chose silence. He chose a meal. He chose bare hands to wash the dusty feet of men. There was no display of power, only love, raw, humble, and wounded. What made that night so profound wasn't a miracle or supernatural event, but the way the Holy One willingly descended lower than anyone had ever dared. And in the deepest place of that descent, he did something seemingly ordinary. He broke bread and shared a cup. Yet in his hands the ordinary became eternal. "This is my body given for you." Those weren't just words of a final meal. They were a covenant, a quiet declaration still echoing today. True love holds nothing back. True love gives itself completely to the very end. But on that same night we also saw something else: betrayal. We often think of Judas as someone else, as a distant villain. But Judas isn't a disconnected moral tale, he's a mirror. Because betrayal doesn't start with a kiss. It starts with a heart that has long drifted away. And if we're honest, at some point in life each of us has been a Judas. When we chose what was easy over what was right. When we stayed silent instead of standing for truth. And then Jesus walked away. Not with anger, not with blame. He went to Gethsemane, the place most of us would rather skip. Because there he did the hardest thing of all, obeyed through fear. We often think holiness means never being afraid, but no, true holiness is being afraid and still choosing to love. That's what happened in Gethsemane, a trembling heart whispering, "Not my will, but yours be done." You may have read these verses before, but tonight try entering the story differently. What if you were one of the people sitting at that table? What if you saw Jesus kneel before you? What if you held the bread he gave you? What would you do? This is no longer a tale of long ago, it's an invitation for right now. Holy Thursday doesn't open with a voice from heaven, it begins with the clinking of cups in a quiet room in Jerusalem. The Last Supper may appear like just another meal, but it is, in truth, the doorway to a great mystery. A place where God not only appears, but gives himself away. We've become so familiar with the idea of communion that we sometimes forget before we can commune with a holy God, we must first enter into a real relationship. One that is risky, vulnerable, and asks us to be broken. The bread broken isn't just the body of Christ. It's a symbol of a love willing to be shattered for someone else. And when he lifts the cup, he doesn't just invite us to drink wine, he invites us to drink the cost of love, sacrifice. And then he bends down, not to preach, but to wash feet, a task even servants would rather avoid. And in doing so, he wasn't giving a moral lecture. He was rewriting the entire order of the world, where the highest is the one who bows the lowest, where true power is measured by the depth of love. Peter didn't understand, and neither do we, because some part of us still resists this truth, that real love stoops low, touches another's weakness with bare hands. But if we won't let Him wash our feet, we won't let Him save us. Because salvation doesn't come through might, but through a love willing to do the work of a servant, even for a traitor. That's what makes this night so painfully beautiful. He knew Judas would betray Him. Yet, He still washed His feet, still handed Him the bread. He didn't stop Him. Because real love doesn't control. It offers freedom, even if it leads to betrayal. And after the meal, He walked into Gethsemane, not as a warrior, but as a stripped-down human being, trembling before the darkness. There Jesus didn't teach. He prayed. He sweat blood. He didn't pretend to be strong. He allowed Himself to be afraid, and in that moment, He showed us. True courage isn't the absence of fear, but choosing obedience in spite of it. Strangely enough, it was when the disciples fell asleep, when the prayer was swallowed in darkness, that salvation quietly began. No loud declarations, no miracles, just one who was alone and still chose to love to the end. Judas returned, not with remorse, but with a kiss, a sign of betrayal wrapped in the disguise of intimacy. But Jesus didn't flinch. He didn't run. He simply asked, "Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" That question wasn't just for Judas. It's for all of us. For those who still go to church, kneel in prayer, receive the bread, while our hearts quietly drift away from our teacher. We often speak of salvation as something lofty, a theological concept, a religious ideal. But Holy Thursday reveals this. Salvation begins in the simple things: a patient gaze, hands that wash feet, a piece of bread broken without reservation. God doesn't save us through grand displays, but through the way He shows up in the smallest acts. And that very simplicity is what makes His love uncomfortable. Uncomfortable, because that love won't let us stay on the sidelines. It refuses indifference. You can't walk past a God who kneels to wash your feet and say, "Well, that doesn't concern me." Because if God stoops low, then no matter who you are, you can no longer stand above anyone else. We live in an age obsessed with achievement, status, recognition. But Holy Thursday draws us into a different reality, where the leader is the servant, and true greatness is measured by love given in silence. No one applauds a foot washing, but heaven stands in reverent awe, and that continues even now. Every time you forgive when wronged, every time you serve without expecting credit, every time you love someone who doesn't love you back, you are reliving the actions of Christ that night. Don't wait for another miracle. You are the miracle, if you dare to live the way He lived. And Judas? His story will always leave us unsettled. How could someone who walked with Jesus, heard His teachings, witnessed His miracles, still betray Him? But maybe the real tragedy wasn't the betrayal, it was that He didn't return. Because even in betrayal, Christ still loves. But to be saved, you must allow yourself to be loved. And Judas, for whatever reason, couldn't. Perhaps he believed in justice more than mercy, and that is a tragedy. That night, after all the final words, sacred gestures, after the bloody sweat beneath the olive trees, after the kiss of betrayal and the chaos that followed, Jesus did not hide. He did not fight. He did not bargain. He simply said, "I am He." 3 simple words, yet the most powerful declaration ever spoken in human history. In the dark, surrounded by hatred and violence, God didn't escape with a miracle. He stayed with presence. And in that moment, He began His walk to the cross. It's easy to judge the disciples. They fell asleep in the garden. They argued over who would sit at His right and left. They didn't understand His words. They scattered when he was arrested. One denied him 3 times, one betrayed, 10 were silent. And we, reading their stories, shake our heads, thinking, if I had been there, I wouldn't have done that. But the truth is, we were there, and we're no better. We've dozed off when invited to pray. We've stayed silent when truth needed a voice. We've chosen safety over faithfulness. We've denied him, not with words, but with our indifference, our fear, our self-interest. Yet Jesus didn't choose perfect people. He chose the clumsy, the confused, the easily shaken, people who, despite everything, still dared to follow. Their weakness didn't shame him. On the contrary, it created space for grace to pour in. Faith isn't absolute confidence in yourself. Faith is the humility to know you need saving and the courage to keep walking, even when you stumble, even when you don't yet understand. When Jesus looked at Simon Peter after the 3 denials, it wasn't a look of condemnation. It was the gaze of someone who fully knew human frailty and still loved, still trusted, still gave him a mission: feed my sheep. As C.S. Lewis once suggested, the sacred is rarely comfortable. It forces us to see ourselves clearly. It calls us to change. And often, it's in our very weakness that we begin to understand the depth of mercy. Holy Thursday isn't just about Jesus. It's also about Peter, who represents all of us, the one who swore he would die for the Lord and yet trembled before a servant girl. And Peter proves this truth. Salvation isn't for the perfect, it's for those who dare to return. A true disciple isn't someone who never falls, but someone who rises again under the merciful gaze of their teacher. Holiness isn't an achievement, it's a response. Lord, you know that I love you. It is paradoxical to think that the Church, this mystery of the eternal and the sacred, was not built upon perfection, but upon broken hearts. And yet, that is exactly how God works, through a logic that defies ours, full of paradox and meaning. The Church isn't a gathering of flawless people. It is a community of the humbled, who've accepted God's mercy and allowed Him to transform their wounds into testimonies of love. The Church in its deepest essence was not built by heroes with supernatural strength or flawless saints. Instead, it was formed by ordinary people, those who had stumbled, who had feared, who had denied, but who were also the first to return with repentance and hope. On Holy Thursday, a night filled with tragedy and mystery, this truth is revealed with piercing clarity. That night, the disciples of Jesus, the very ones who would become the foundation of the Church, faced some of the darkest moments of their lives. Peter, the one chosen to be the rock, denied his Lord 3 times. The others, instead of standing firm, fled when Jesus was arrested. They were not the kind of people the world would deem worthy. They were not strong, not loyal, not perfect, and yet miraculously it was these very people, in all their weakness, whom Christ chose to carry forth His mission. Why? Not because they possessed extraordinary talent or noble character, but because they knew they needed mercy. They had tasted the shame of failure, the sorrow of betrayal, and in those broken moments they encountered the forgiving gaze of God. That gaze did not judge, did not condemn. It simply invited them to return, to rise, and to keep walking. It was God's mercy that turned their shattered hearts into living stones, building the Church. The Church, therefore, is not a religion for the strong or the self-righteous. It is good news for the weak, for those who know they cannot stand on their own. Christianity is not the story of invincible heroes. It is the story of a God who chooses to walk with the broken, the defeated, the ones who have nothing left. It is in weakness that God's power is revealed. As St. Paul once wrote, "When I am weak, then I am strong." 2 Corinthians 12:10. These are not just paradoxical words, they are a core truth of Christian faith. Real strength does not come from self-reliance, but from humbly receiving the grace of God, The church exists not to glorify human success, but to testify to the relentless love of a God who never gives up on us, even when we walk away from Him. The church was not born from a spectacular event or a dazzling miracle before the crowds. It began in a quiet room, where a small group of trembling, anxious men gathered. On Holy Thursday, Jesus instituted the Eucharist, giving His very body and blood to the disciples. He washed their feet and taught them the lesson of service and love. And yet, moments later, they fell. They slept while He prayed in Gethsemane. They scattered when He was arrested. Peter denied Him, Judas betrayed Him. And yet it was in that very room, in the atmosphere of failure and brokenness, that the church was born. Not because the disciples did anything extraordinary, but because they were loved in an extraordinary way. A piece of bread and a sip of wine, the simplest of things, became signs of reconciliation between heaven and earth. A single forgiving gaze from Jesus saved a whole life, like when He looked at Peter after the rooster crowed. It was that love, not human strength, that laid the foundation of the church. When faced with the holy like the disciples on Holy Thursday, the human instinct is often fear. The light of holiness exposes the dark corners of our soul, and we want to hide or flee. We fear judgment, rejection, the truth about ourselves. But in that moment, if we dare to open our hearts, if we let ourselves be touched by the love of God, everything changes. The love of God is not a cold spotlight exposing flaws for condemnation. It is a flame that warms, an embrace that comforts, a voice that gently calls us home. When the disciples returned after their fall, they didn't find a God of blame, but a God with open arms. That forgiveness transformed them, from fearful men into courageous witnesses, willing to lay down their lives to proclaim the good news. And the mystery of Holy Thursday is not confined to churches or liturgical rituals. It continues in the ordinary rhythms of daily life, in the small moments that hold eternal meaning. Every time you forgive without being asked to, you live the spirit of Holy Thursday. Every time you serve without seeking praise, you extend the lesson of Jesus' foot washing. Every time you lower yourself out of love, not out of weakness, you participate in the mystery of the church. The church is not merely grand buildings or religious institutions. It is a community of people living in the Spirit of Christ, bringing His love and mercy into the world. That is why the church is never perfect. It carries within it wounds and imperfections because it is built by broken people. But it is in that very brokenness that God works, transforms, and makes all things new. The mission of the church, proclaiming mercy. The mission of the church is not to display power or seek glory for itself. The mission of the church is to proclaim the mercy of God, a mercy extended to all people, especially the weak, the wounded, and the lost. The church exists to tell the world that no one is forgotten, that God never gives up on anyone, even when we give up on ourselves. In a world filled with competition and harsh judgment, where human worth is often measured by success and strength, the church brings a radical message. Your true value is not in what you achieve, but in the fact that you are loved. And that love, made most visible on the night of Holy Thursday, is the foundation of everything the church stands for. The church, with all its mystery and meaning, is not some distant entity confined to religious rituals. It is alive in every moment we choose love, forgiveness, and service. Each one of us, no matter how weak or broken, is called to be part of the church, not by becoming perfect, but by allowing our hearts to be touched by the love of God. Holy Thursday reminds us that the church was not built upon perfection, but upon broken hearts healed by mercy. And it is in this journey that we discover the deepest meaning of faith, a God who is not ashamed to walk with the fallen, a God who loves us even when we feel unworthy, and a God who invites us to live out that same love in our own lives.